Test, test, one, two, three.
Hello? Yep, there we go.
Before we get started tonight, if anyone has public comment, please fill out a form and get it to Terry. Terry, would you raise your hand, please? Just right there before we get started. Thank you. Yes.
Ted, like, do you need those?
I saw that. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. We'll get started in one moment.
But not today. I said, hey, my favorite friend, we have a lot to talk about, but not today. Good things.
Okay, we'll call this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Walters,
Here.
Mr. Sawalish,
Here.
Mrs. Roop,
Here.
Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Brown,
Here.
Mrs. Galbraith is here, Mr. Albrecht.
Here. Please rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And Ms. Roop, would you please recite our mission statement?
Sure. Our mission is to empower each student to positively impact the world for a bright new future.
Thank you. Before we get started, could everyone on these two sides of the table flip your name plate around so we know who you are? So now that we're here. So, thank you. Okay. Any public comment, Terry?
No, sir.
Okay. With that, then I will turn it over to the superintendent.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we are really pleased to be here tonight. We have our Finance Committee and our Facility Committee here jointly to have an opportunity to share their work with the board and the larger community on some of the projects that we've been discussing, the financing of these projects, and really wanting an opportunity to engage in some really good dialogue about these as we begin to move forward. Again, tonight, we're not voting on anything. These are all supposed plans as how we're going to be moving forward, because as you know, as you get more information, sometimes there's tweaking that needs to be done. So we want to make sure that we keep that in mind. For tonight's meeting, we have an agenda. I think all of you have that in front of you. Last time that we met, the Facility Committee and the Finance Committee had been meeting probably since early fall. And each one was given them a particular task. As you can see on the strategic plan goals, we were charged with coming up with some equitable facilities, as well as working on a way to finance them in a judicious manner. As the committees have met, the Facilities Committee believes that they have a solid proposal for a plan, a model, if you will, based on the information that we've received and many discussions. And the Finance Committee also believes that they have some ideas on how to finance. So it's time that we both kind of get together. So how we're going to structure our meeting, I am going to ask for a timekeeper to keep us organized. Is there anybody that would like to be a timekeeper? Ms. Galbraith, thank you for doing that.
It would be my pleasure.
Absolutely. And then from each of my committees, my Finance Committee, would there be anybody that would be willing to just kind of be the reporter, just to give some of the highlights? Anybody?
Thanks, Dr. Hunt.
Wow. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but just kind of overall highlights. And then from our Facility Committee, anybody would be willing to just some high-level highlights when we're ready?
Thanks, Mrs. Smith.
So thank you for apparently.
Thanks, Mike.
So what we're going to do first, we're going to have our Facility Committee work to share some of the highlights. So we would like to cover some of the updates in A from about maybe 5 to 5:50. And then we're going to leave about 20 minutes for questions. So for B, we're going to look around 6 to 6:20 to cover questions. And then we're going to move to the Finance Committee. We're going to give them an opportunity to share. And they're going to be sharing their plan from about 6:20 to 6:30 or so. And then we've got Bob Lewis from 6:30 to 7. We're going to give him an opportunity to really share some of the guts of the financing piece. And then we'll look for some questions around 7 to 7:20. And then we're hoping that we can kind of tie this up around 7:30. So that's our rough time frame to kind of keep the meeting going for those that are involved. So at the beginning for Facility Committee, I'll go ahead and share just a few things. So we have 3 documents for you, so I'm going to let you start looking for those. We have the one that's the 11 by 14, so if you want to pull that out. And then we have a second handout, which is called the light bulb handout, that has our proposed model on it. So we're going to start taking a look at those first. And believe me, anybody can jump in on this conversation. So when we first talked with the Facility Committee, we had narrowed down to about three various options that you see before you. We had the Model 1, which was really a repair in place. It was basically looking at our safety issues, repairing Crete, Balmoral, but it also included adding an extra wing onto the ELC to grow that program. It required an extra wing at the high school and repairing of Talala School and so forth. So that was really the basic model. So that was option 1. We'll go into more details later on that. Option 2 was more of a hybrid. The hybrid model was really focusing on consolidating Crete and Balmoral schools and still having some of those additions at the middle school, ELC, and so forth. And then the third model was really focusing on community centers. That was combining Crete, Balmoral, but also Talala and CSK. So that was our third model. So we're really going to focus on Model 2 because that is the model that the committee was recommending. So I'm going to have us move to the light bulb model. And then we can go back between these 2 sheets as you've got questions. So if you've got questions as we're moving along, write them down so that when we move to the questions section, you don't lose them. And Ken, I will ask you to help chime in as we need to and so forth. So Mr. Smith, would you be able to maybe talk a little bit about the proposed model here?
Do we have
A microphone.
Yep.
Here we go.
Hello?
Yep.
There you go. You're good.
Okay. The consensus was of the group, I mean, it wasn't 100% in any one direction, but, you know, the general consensus boiled down to this, that if we could not go to referendum to support 2 or 3, we'd fall back to the option 1. But option 2 was somewhat more favorable, being that we had another new school in the program, and that the more need would be met, and some of these other aging facilities would be eliminated. So that would take away from the maintenance budgets and the ongoing upkeep of those buildings. The other issues that we have to solve with these, you know, not just the schools, but we have to deal with the ELC. It's too small. So we either have to add on or find a new place for the administration folks. We also need to find a place for buildings and grounds. You know, so Talala would be left in the mix, and it would receive their necessary upgrades and some, you know, other facility needs to nice and then bring that facility up to a more even standard with the other facilities that would be modernized. The timeline is 5 to 7 years. You know, we couldn't get it all done at once. You wouldn't have places to put students, for one thing. And, you know, the borrowing would be easier over a period of time to all up from day one and do a shotgun approach.
Yeah, for those in the audience, I'm going to just read just real quickly what the model looked like. Mr. Smith was going in and certainly analyzing that. So the model that was selected was a new elementary school for Crete, and that was going to be merging the Crete Elementary School and Balmoral School. And that was going to be where the 6th grade center is. Building and constructing a new Csk King Magnet School in University Park. The MEC program, which is in Monee, would be moved to a wing at the high school. And Talala, again, would receive their life safety. And did I cover them all? The other beauty behind this project was that all the buildings that were going to be vacated were going to be donated back to the communities in which they reside, so that they could use them for park programs, community centers, and so forth. And we're looking at probably about 5 to 7 years on getting all of these done at the same time. So is there anybody on these committees that would like to add to any of this? Any discussions that we had? Yes.
Although I am somewhat in lockstep with what's going on, some of these things that are shown on the larger
spreadsheet need clarification before I'm going to be able to be behind this 100%. So I articulated those at the last meeting, and until that happens, I'm going to be reserved in my comments.
Okay, we're going to get to that when it comes to maybe the questions part, which I think we might be there shortly. Any other questions or comments from any of the other committees?
Oh, I think the one thing you, in terms of additions, also to be addition to the middle school.
Yes.
And to accommodate capacity that we just don't have today.
Right.
And then could you talk about, in terms of the new CSK Magnet School in University Park, maybe 2 options there for replacement?
Right. We had discussed some possibilities for a new location for the CSK building. And in working with the Village of University Park, there was 2 sites that might be available. One would be perhaps near the current middle school, which would be adjacent property. They are beginning to look at that at this point, or we could possibly have an IB campus. Another possibility was some land off of Exchange, which is really behind the firehouse, the village hall. There's about 15 acres behind that. So those are some 2 options that we would be looking at with University Park for relocating. The beauty behind that, if we're going to be making a new building, it's very difficult to do any renovations when students are in the building. So this would lend itself very easily to build away from the current building, so it would be ready to go, and we can move much faster with that. Okay.
Just a question in general for the Facilities Committee. When we received this part of the Finance Committee, we understood this to be unanimous. Were there any issues that you guys thought that probably needed to be resolved or that were, you kind of went forward with this and maybe needed to be discussed a little bit further?
Just for me, I think at one of the meetings, I think the meeting before the last one, we really didn't dissect the numbers to the penny, so to speak. That's yet to be determined. But I did ask the question, I don't know if we have the answer. For the middle school addition, we have 18,000 square feet. Do we know how many rooms that consists of? Because when it initially was to add additional rooms, we were talking about 4 rooms. I don't know what that equated to as far as square footage is concerned. But do we know how many? Is it still 4 rooms or is it 6 rooms, 12 rooms? 8.
The addition to the middle school was 10 new classrooms, but in order to gain access to those 10, you would have to eliminate 2 existing rooms. So it was a net of 8 additional classrooms to the school.
Oh, really?
Yes. Two floors, basically 5 classrooms per floor. And again, just the access to, in the current plan, Mr. Brown, and again, that's obviously it's not designed,
sure.
So it's subject to change.
Okay, so 10 rooms, we do away with 2 relatively newer rooms that, according to
yes.
2016 when the building was put up, and as it will give us a net gain of 8.
That's in this current diagram that we had generated a year ago.
Okay.
And again, it's not final, so it
sure.
is certainly subject to change.
Like I said, we don't have to get into all the pennies and dimes and nickels and all that at this point. So, but that was a gap that I had at that point. Okay, thank you.
Dave, I know one thing that came out of the Finance Committee, I think some folks were wondering about the square footage of some buildings, why some were bigger than others, comparatively with the CSK model versus the.
Yeah, basically when you build a new school, there are core facilities that are in a school, gymnasium, an art room, music room, the principal's office. And when you have a small number of students in those schools, the square foot per student for those common spaces, those core spaces, have to get divided among those students. So the net effect is that the area per student for the total school is a higher number in a small school compared to a larger school. So in this case, the 900 student elementary that would be for Crete and Balmoral, we're looking at a facility about 108,000, and which results in 120 square foot per student, which is that's in going with facilities of this that size and that number of students is pretty consistent. A 300 student new elementary school for CSK, that's a pretty small school in today's school market. And the result is just because the 300 students still need a gymnasium and they need an art room and a music room and some of those other core spaces, that it results in the square foot per student is just, it's a higher number. And the our current target is somewhere around 60,000. Again, we will be going through a process with the district on programming to determine the final square footage, the actual square footage, but it won't be anything more than 60, I can tell you that, because this is where the budget is. But we will look to have it smaller if we can, so that we can save district money going forward. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, what other questions do we have? We could probably move right into the question.
Yeah, I would like to know some of the conversations around just keeping Talala and giving them the enhancements in the life safety, as opposed to when you guys decided to do option 2, to do the new school just for CSK and not the combination of CSK and Talala. I would just like to know what some of the discussion was. I mean, I understand part of it is it's not a good time for Park Forest. They're already losing a school. But was there anything other than that that went into that thought process?
So if you don't mind, I'd like to speak on that. So we did talk about that. And a year ago, when 4 of us or 3 of us were running, there were signs all over, save Talala and CSK. Brett Millsap brought up a good point that, you know, it is tough times over there, that they're losing Rich East. And then in the same sense, we're just going to, and I hate to say the reality is, rip that school away from them as well, and their for their students. So we did take some of that thought process and we did discuss, we broke into 3 groups. And I think as a facility committee, you know, their job was to do the money, but we were trying to come up with the most logical solution for long term, because we've asked the finance committee to go to, and Dr. Kerr to go to Springfield and extend our bonds for 30 years. Well, what makes most sense? If we're talking about a plan of building and in 10 years or less, we have to talk about new buildings, then the plan doesn't make sense. But we picked option 2, and I think the 3 groups collectively talked that Talala would stay in Park Forest, which a year ago, and probably even today, if you ask their mayor and their folks, that they want to keep that in their neighborhood. Just as much as we've talked about taking CSK and moving it over, whether we make it next to the junior high or on the north side of the exchange, keeping that where it's at as well. But the long-term goal is at the end of option 2, I think we collectively agreed that we wouldn't need a new building in this district if we took Talala that was graded as C, made our improvements, changed it to a B, we would need a new building for at least 20 years. So that way, if you start talking about a new building in 20 years or 22 years or 24, we all know the process that even if we approve a new building today, it'll be 2 years. There's a time frame to it. So we figured by the time 20 some years comes down, the bonds will be rolling off at 30. The district can start talking about changes. And the only factor in there that we discussed was explosive growth, which I don't see, but you can never rule out anything. So I think that was.
Rule it out, but I think right now what we're seeing is decline in population. I went through since 2015 and it's steadily declined. And if we're talking about a D for or a C for Talala and a D for CSK, but really what we're talking about is 1.5 points, because the C that Talala has is 70.5 and the D CSK has a 69. So we're not talking about a huge difference between those 2 buildings. And that's why I'm wondering, you know, I understand feeling bad for a city, and I really don't want to take anyone's neighborhood school away. That's not my goal. I just think that we have to think of the bigger picture and what really makes sense. And then, is that really what's better for the kids? Is it really better that they have their neighborhood school, or would it be better if they go a couple miles away and have a spanking new school?
And I think part of that we talked about, and again, if anybody else from the facility committee, but the thought process is the idea of an equity thought in there is that we are taking 2 schools with Fs and a school with a D and applying our money mainly there, and then we can upgrade the other one. I mean, there was really no right answer. The idea is, obviously, if we did grade centers, we would save more money if we can combine schools, Crete, Balmoral, Talala, and CSK. But we're trying to live in today and still have, have some compassion, for them.
I'll just say, Ms. Roop, that was really why I wanted to have this meeting, so we could kind of get some of the reasoning behind some of the decisions that were made. Not that the finance committee disagreed upon it, but we wanted to have an understanding along with getting some itemization of the numbers behind the costs.
I just want to say I agree with Mrs. Roop over here. I do like the idea we're combining Crete and Balmoral to combine the Talala with the CSK school. I don't think when you say neighborhood school, we have kids that come from all over. For Crete, for instance, we have kids that come all the way from state line. I think when our size district, we have to keep in mind nobody can really have it right in their backyard. So I think if you could find a property between the two, between Park Forest and University Park, that might be an option too, that we could combine the two schools. So that's just another thought. So
How many kids are right now are going to Talala that are from University Park?
95. Yeah, I haven't had time to look at all the numbers. I asked for a lot of information and it was given to us today. And I really haven't had time to really look through it. But those are the types of things I think we need to look at. I know we're saying, well, first we're going to decide on facilities and then all that kind of stuff comes next. But I don't understand how you could talk about facilities without talking about long-term, what students are going to go there and where the students are now. Yeah, the kids from University Park go all over the place. And like I said, I haven't had time to look at this, but 95 are at Talala out of the 271 or.
I'd also like to know what the attendance boundaries are going to look like when if this is adopted. I'd like to see what that looks like.
Okay, I like what Ms. Walters was saying about the property, if it was possible. I think that we were looking at things from a compassion side of what Park Forest is going through. Recently in University Park, we had some community visioning workshops, and a lot of the things that came out of those workshops was what were the reasons why people moved into the community to begin with. What their expectations were to take their kids to school, what kind of environment that they felt like they wanted to grow up in. And I think the Talala component speaks to that. Still having the school in the community. CSK, same thing. No one wants a blank, empty building in the middle of Black Hawk, for all kinds of things to happen. So I think it's important that those community schools, especially in this time period, if it's financially able to happen, that they should stay put if possible.
And real quick, Cheryl, I know you had mentioned 95 kids to Ms. Reinhorn, but remember those kids are moved around because of the IB program. So I think we haven't even. Which
also is another discussion.
Right, we haven't even discussed that
Yeah.
yet, but that's the reason why they're there. Otherwise,
but I do think it has to be a part of the discussion because programming and size of buildings and stuff will make a difference. So if we want equity for all kids, I think it's something that the IB in the magnet school for only some kids with a lottery is not equitable. So we're not really practicing what we've been preaching about equity. There's many kids in University Park that if they don't happen to make the lottery, they don't get into the school. So it's not equitable for those kids. So I think that's something we really have to think about in regards to, we have to think about programming so that we know what size buildings we're going to need. And this whole idea of community schools, right now, I don't see the magnet school as a community school because the kids are coming in from all over.
I would like to see the numbers. If you're stating 95 of those Talala kids are going to CSK because of IB.
No, the opposite way around, 95 kids.
95 kids from University Park.
Oh, 95, okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying 95 for Tallahassee kids. I'm going to say that doesn't equal the lottery numbers, so we're way out of proportion.
No, 95
So,
kids from
I'm
Unity
sorry,
Park.
I thought you
Kids from
flipped it.
Unity Park are going to Monee. They're going to Tallahassee. They're going to.
Right, right, but we have other kids going to other towns also because Crete has an overabundance in fifth grade, so we have to farm them out in order to give them all
Yes.
a shot. So it's not just, we're not really looking at community schools right now.
Right.
Because we are having to send our kids to different locations and at different times. If we get 20 kids that register in January and Crete is full, we have to divvy those kids up. And they may come back to Crete the next year, but you don't really know. So I guess the numbers fluctuate all the time, correct? Depending on enrollment, correct? Okay.
Okay, if I can please interject, thank you. And I think it's important around the conversation about community schools. Of course, it's somewhat subjective and it's hard to have that conversation without including programming conversation as well, because it's important to us as a community. I can say that CSK is a community school for me. I have two sons that went to that school from kindergarten all the way through. So that's very subjective. And as a resident of University Park, it is absolutely a community school for us. Now, I would also say there are a number of neighboring families that did not get the opportunity to be a part of CSK, of course, because of the lottery system. We were just very fortunate. My wife was dogmatic about being a part of the process when we first got there. We've been there 15 years. But I will say that the conversation then has to include programming, because what's most important to us is not necessarily the quality of facility in its A grade rather than the quality of the programming. That's what we found at CSK. So the question of equitability, we're most lean on the programming rather than the facility, but I think both things must be discussed in some capacity.
I think one other thing, just looking at the two sites, if we sticking with option 2, the hybrid plan, I would say that if we can position the one school close to the middle school, current middle school, and have an IB campus, that gives us the most flexibility going forward in terms of how we would use that facility. So that to me makes the most sense. That's the way
Yeah,
we're gonna
we're
go.
hoping, we're going to be working with University Park Village and hoping we can get some answers on those properties fairly soon. Any other clarifying questions from the Finance Committee to the Facility Committee?
After discussing this with my esteemed colleague here, I'm going to say something that's not going to be popular, which is I have a history of doing that type of thing. If we're looking at this, and I have to say this from an individual standpoint, if you're looking at this from an emotional standpoint, you're doing the wrong thing. Because emotions change just like the weather. You need to be looking at this from a factual standpoint. Facts tend to bear out the best over time. So please, I encourage everyone to put their emotions aside and their I wants and I gotta haves aside and make decisions in regards to this, both the financing and the size of the buildings and the location of the buildings, based upon the facts that are being presented, not upon what you personally want or you feel that some other community wants or some other entity wants, because they're not the ones making the decision. You are. And having been in local government for almost more than 35 years, I always try to make my decisions based upon fact and not upon emotion, because in the long run, you'll be supported by the decisions that you make. And that's my counsel to the group.
Thank you. All right, I think we're probably ready to move on. We are going to move on to the Finance Committee. I'll give a brief update, some of the things that happened in the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee was really focused on trying to figure out how to pay for all of this. So our first charge was trying to figure out how we could lower our payments, and that's where the discussion was about extending the debt payment from 20 to 30 years. And those are some of the things that are going on right now. We do have a proposed bill that's being sponsored by Thaddeus Jones and Anthony DeLuca. And we also have a partner at the Senate level, Patrick Joyce. They are willing to champion our bill to get this extended. As part of delivering a package, I've been asked to go out there and recruit support from each of our mayors, have a public hearing, which will take place next week, March 10th at 5:30 in room 35, and then also have a board resolution to show the community's interest in supporting this 20 to 30-year extension. So we are in the midst of doing that. We are waiting to find out how it pans out, probably in April or May, if we have that extension or not. Everything is relying on that. So we can't do anything until that passes. So we're kind of in limbo. So we're continuing to go on and work with the plan as far as we can, contingent on that. At our last meeting, we had both Bob Lewis from PMA as well as our attorney present to talk about really the legal ramifications for borrowing. And our attorney shared with us, and I did have a copy of this for each of you. We won't read it, but this is what school code says about the financing. In essence, it says, if you are going to be building new buildings, referendums, you need to have that out there. However, if we're going to be doing lease certificates or leasing the buildings, we can do an alternative bond as well, which we're going to spend a few minutes talking out with Bob Lewis. Reverend Hunt, is there anything else that I have not shared that you can pick up on here?
No, I think you've pretty thoroughly covered it. Again, speaking on behalf of the Finance Committee, the one thing that we are concerned with is getting some depth, some itemization in terms of these numbers that we have in front of us. And that was the reason that we wanted to get some sort of understanding from the Facilities Committee on these particular projects.
So harder numbers, so to speak. Yeah, most of these have been ranges depending on once we start the.
Yeah, because we realize that we're going to have to spend money, but if we are going to have to spend money and we're representing the community, we need to be able to justify that to the community.
Absolutely. At this point, does anybody in the Facility Committee have any questions of the finance, or are we ready to move on to hear our presentation from Bob Lewis? All right, Bob, I'm going to turn it, is there a question?
I was just going to ask the architect, basically when I do the math here, your extension on a cost per square foot is assuming a linear existence. And is it really going to be linear? Because if it's not, then these are the wrong numbers.
Thank you.
We were using cost per square foot based upon actually a current project that bid 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, but these numbers existed before 2 weeks ago, did it not?
And we verified those.
Okay.
And they came in, it had been estimated previously, and bids came in and it was essentially at that point. It actually came in a little bit less. So what this can do then is kind of carry some inflation moving forward.
Okay, but again, is it linear?
It is linear for those buildings, yes.
I guess I just academically find that hard to believe, but I guess if that's what you say it is.
All right.
Mike, linear versus what?
Well,
If you do the math, the math comes out to $302.40 a square foot, no matter which one of these schools you look at. And I have a hard time believing that you can build a 108,000 square foot building for the same cost per square foot as an 84,000 or a 60,000. I don't think that 302 applies equally across the board, but the way it's been calculated, it's linear. They're saying 80,000 square feet times 302, that's the number. I don't think that that building is linear. I think that it's probably more parabolic and not linear.
At this point, we would need to get a construction manager involved to help verify the numbers, and we absolutely recommend that happens. But when we're doing budgeting like this, we use $270 for building only, then we add a percentage for site, we add in FF&E, we add in fees and contingencies, and then it all totals up and it comes to that, whatever that $302.
I guess I just want everybody to understand that, I'm kind of a math guy, so I look at that kind of stuff, but I personally have never experienced it to be that way. It should be cheaper the larger you go, in my estimation.
It could very well be. Again, we'll need to have that verified by a construction manager, but for budgeting point of view, that's the information that we move forward is basically a cost per square foot on construction and site work.
Isn't there a difference in cost when you're building a elementary school as opposed to a middle school and a high school, regardless if it's 2 square feet for an elementary school, 2 square feet for a middle school, 2 square feet for a high school? Depending on what type of school, would that price vary in square feet?
Those costs are going to be comparable. They're not that far. They're not that different. There are some higher quality systems like in a high school. So that cost per square foot would end up being more. But what really becomes the bigger driver in the cost is just the overall square footage of the building becomes significantly more. So you're looking at elementary school, 900 student elementary, 120 square foot per student. If you were to do, for the high school, you're probably in that 160, 180 square foot per student, because you have field houses and gyms and auditoriums. And again, these common spaces that aren't in a elementary have to get spread across the student population. So it's those extra spaces, there's science labs and that aren't in elementary. So that's what kind of grows that square foot per student. That is really the big driver in why high schools are going to be a lot more expensive than an elementary. They're just bigger buildings and they need more space per each of the students.
Okay. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. All right, Bob, I'm going to turn this over to you at this point so you can entertain us with all this good information.
So the presentation you have here tonight, there's a lot of information in the appendices. That's just there for backup for your own perusal later on. I only plan to go through the body of the presentation. And as the scope of the plan, the construction plan has changed. It's really caused us, the committee and the advisors to the committee, to change the process for how best to do the plan of finance. So prior plans, we were talking about doing things on a non-referendum basis. We didn't have to go to the voters. As it's gotten larger, for reasons I'll go through in a moment, it seems to make more sense that you would go through a referendum plan. So the goal of tonight's presentation is to give you an overview of how school finance works in Illinois, and then look at a couple different plans, 20 years for one, 30 years for the other, which the goal of that is to show you why the district really thinks it will benefit from the 30-year legislation in putting together this plan of finance. So I'm flipping forward to page 3. Page 3 shows you the calculation of the district's legal debt margin, and that changes over time. The two largest determining factors in this calculation is the equalized assessed value of the district and the amount of principal that's outstanding. So it's principal that goes in this calculation, not principal and interest. So putting your focus onto levy year 19, because levy year 19 is for taxes collected in 20 for the school's 21 fiscal year. So that's what's coming up upon us now. So we take your EAV, here it's showing as 776 million. That's an estimate this time. We don't know what EAV will be until the end of May. Multiply that by 13.8%. That's the applicable percentage for a unit district. You get 107 million, and you subtract the amount of principal outstanding, you get roughly $65 million is the legal debt margin of the district. Think of that as a credit card limit. Your credit card limit determines the amount you can have outstanding at any one time on your credit card, okay? It's not looking at the interest you got paid on your credit card, it's just looking at the balance on your credit card of what you owe. So there are certain exemptions from this legal debt margin that the prior plans of finance was going to take advantage of with working cash bonds, funding bonds, and alternate obligations all have various exemptions from that. Referendum bonds in excess of 64.5 million would require special legislation. So if the district and its committees are wanting to pursue the referendum plan, what we would recommend, we talked about the finance committee, is you would also add to your legislation request for an exemption from your legal debt margin. There's been 40 different school districts that have been granted that exemption over the years. You can look in the school code and see all those exemptions that are there. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So how do school districts go about accessing funds in the capital markets? For this, we have to look at what the school code has to say. So the school code authorizes bonds called general obligation bonds. That for you as a school district or any type of issuer across the country, whether you're city or village, park district, that if you issue a general obligation bond, it generally means that there's a separate property tax that's being put in place to support that bond issue. So it doesn't impact your operating funds, because that's key, that the operating funds are not impacted by the debt. Otherwise, it puts a additional burden on the operating funds than it already has in educating the students and paying teacher salaries and other type of expenditures. If you're a bond investor, general obligation means it's the highest form of security. I know what you're pledging to repay me. You're pledging to pay me from a tax that's being derived from your tax base. So it gives me comfort in knowing that I will be paid as long as the tax is levied. It doesn't matter how well the operating funds are doing, I'm going to be paid. So that's what the term general obligation means. Now, those types of bonds can be authorized two different ways. One is via referendum. The school code describes what are called building bonds. Those are typically used for large capital projects, especially when you're considering new buildings. And then there's non-referendum GO bonds, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail on subsequent slides. So they're also paid from a separate tax, but the way that they're authorized is different. They don't require direct voter approval. The maximum length in the school code for any general obligation bond is 20 years. Now that's for school districts. Park districts have 25 years. Non-home rule cities or villages have 40, or excuse me, 20. Home rule cities or villages have 40. Not many ever go out 40. City of Chicago goes out 40 fairly regularly. So, but other than that, most try to keep it to, I would say 25 to 30 years if the law allows you to go out that far. Because your district, and for a moment here, we're turning our attention to the tax cap law. Because you're in a county that is subject to tax caps, Will County, your ability to levy taxes to pay the payments on your non-referendum bonds is limited by something called the debt service extension base. So this is a second limit that you have to be mindful of. And that came into existence in 1994 when tax caps were applied to across the Collier counties into Cook County. And what that says is at that time in 1994 is your debt service extension base was equal to just under $2.5 million. And the reason for that is because the law says whatever you're levying for non-referendum bonds and your tax caps applied, that became your debt service extension base. So that limits your annual payment at that time to no more than $2.5 million. So you go out 20 years, an annual payment of $2.5 million. In 1999, the voters of the district approved a referendum to increase that limit to almost nearly $6.5 million.
Do you know what drove that decision to go out for referendum?
I do not know. I don't know if nobody at the district knows as far as I know.
Well, I did talk to the superintendent Humphrey during that time period, and that's for a story for another day.
Okay. Or this evening later?
I will tell it to you.
Okay. Proceed.
Because then the voters approved that, but then it was only a couple of years later that that district actually went to the voters for approval of a bond issue. So, something happened between 1999 and 2002 between approving the extension base and actually instead approving a referendum bond. So slide 5 gives you a graphical representation of this. So the red line represents the debt service extension base. Currently, you can go out 20 years. The blue bars represent the current non-referendum general obligation bonds outstanding. So you can see underneath that red line, there's plenty of room for additional bond payments on a non-referendum basis. The amount that you can raise depends upon several factors, but mostly interest. As interest rates go up, you would get less principal out of here because you got to fit principal and interest below the red line. As interest rates go down, you can get more principal out of it. It's the analogy I like to use for this is all of us when we went to buy our first home, one of the first things you had to figure out before you start shopping is what can I afford for my monthly payment? And if you determine, let's say that was $1,000. Well, if interest rates went up, you had to look for a smaller home. If interest rates went down, you could look for a bigger home because you had to fit into your monthly budget a $1,000 mortgage payment, which consisted of principal and interest. So this is the second constraint we're dealing with. Now, your debt service extension base, because the voters approved that, is one of, just so you know, for context, is one of the largest in the state, especially outside of Cook County. If it's not the largest in the Collier counties, it's got to be pretty darn close. So the debt service extension base, again, is a tax cap concept. So debt service extension bases apply to park districts, community colleges, school districts, non-home rule cities and villages. It's not unique to school districts. Now, let's turn our attention back to the school code. Moments ago, I told you could do non-referendum general obligation bonds, and there are various types of non-referendum bonds that the school code says that you can do as a school district. The first one that's used most often is a working cash bond. And despite the name of the type of bond being a working cash bond, they're oftentimes used for capital projects. What happens, you sell a working cash bond, proceeds of that are put into your working cash fund, then they're abated to your capital projects fund so you can do the capital projects. They don't stay in your working cash very long. It's just the authority in the school code that's used to generate the funds. Well, there's a third limitation that you have to calculate for working cash bonds, and that calculation comes out to $39.5 million. So the most amount of working cash bonds you could do would be that amount. Even though your debt service extension base would let you do a much larger issue, this separate formula says you can only do 39.5. So if you're considering a $108 million project, obviously you couldn't use working cash bonds to do it all. Working cash bonds generally are good vehicles for doing ongoing capital needs. So you see a lot of school districts doing roofs and parking lots and other things with working cash bonds, not building new buildings.
So with attempting to borrow working cash bonds, there's a petition period for that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to cover. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Life safety bonds are the second most commonly used type of non-referendum school bond. Now, there's limitations on those. They actually have to be for life safety approved projects. So how do you get a life safety approved project? Schools are required to every 10 years do a life safety survey of all its buildings. And then that information is produced by your architect. All that information is sent down to the state. They go through it and they issue what are called violations, which sounds a little scarier than it really basically means is there's things that you need to do in your buildings. They're classified as A, B, and C. If you get $20 million of life safety approvals, that gives you authority to do a life safety bond. The payment of which would have to fit into your debt service extension base, which for you, the debt service extension base isn't really the constraint, it'd be getting the actual approvals. And the problem you have is not everything you want to do would qualify as life safety. So it really does not become a vehicle to do a significant amount of your capital projects.
Because you can only use that for life safety.
Right, right. Funding bonds are bonds that are used to pay off a claim or liability, like a land contract. I put that there as an example because I had a client that did that. They bought a piece of land and they didn't have the funds within its operating budget to pay for the piece of land, so they issued funding bonds to pay the land contract off, and then they paid for those bonds through their debt service extension base constraint. All three, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about funding bonds on the subsequent slide here. All three of these non-referendum bonds require what's called a Bond Issue Notification Act hearing, or BINA hearing. That's just like the budget hearing you hold every year. Some areas have to do truth and taxation hearings as well, either by choice or because they want to increase the levy more than 5%. It is conducted very similar to those hearings. And this is what was talked about there a moment ago. Funding bonds and working cash bonds also require a 30-day petition process in lieu of a direct referendum. So the way that works is the board issues or approves a resolution to issue working cash bonds and not an amount not to exceed X. From the day that is put into the local paper, the 30-day petition period starts. It's not from when the board passes a resolution, it's from when it hits the paper. And if 10% of the registered voters sign the petition, it would have to go to referendum. What was provided by the Will County Clerk as of the April 19th, 2019 election was 22,000 registered voters in the district. We did go back, Mayor asked us to check on that and actually gave us a slightly different number. It was lower. It was 20 some thousand. So I basically reprinted the same presentation I had before, but then now they're saying it's 20 some thousand. So
Give or take a voter.
right. So
just to be clear, if 2,000 people signed a petition, you'd have to go to referendum anyway.
that's correct.
Okay.
Can I ask you one quick question?
Sure.
What would happen if you issue working cash bonds and then at some point because of payments, not receiving payments, you had to go to some sort of tax anticipation warrants? Are you going to be able to just stop you from doing any tax anticipation warrants?
No, tax anticipation warrants do not count against your legal debt margin. Good question, though.
But I think some places use working cash bonds and then in place of a
You're correct.
anticipation warrant.
You're correct, Mayor, that working cash bond, most of the time, probably 95% of the time, working cash bonds are used for capital projects. But there are school districts that are really in tough financial straits that would do working cash bonds to supplement their operating expenditures. But that's not what's being talked about here.
Now, working cash bonds is considered long-term debt, right?
Yes,
And tax anticipation bonds is considered short-term.
right. That's
Okay.
more like a
So
payday loan.
Payday loan. So that would affect us a little bit on our financial profile from the state under short-term.
Right.
borrowing.
But the reason you do tax anticipation warrants would not because of capital expenditures, because,
You don't have any money.
right.
Bob, people at home who are watching could not hear what the mayor said. Could you kind of summarize what he said and explain what a tax appreciation warrant is?
Sure. So the mayor had asked about if you use working cash bonds, would it prevent you from doing tax anticipation warrants in the event, we're not saying the district would have to do this, but in the event that it ever had to do such a thing to bridge cash flow. Usually a Collier County, and my answer to that was no, it wouldn't preclude you, but why would a school district have to do this? In a Collier County, what typically happens is taxes are received in June. If you're doing tax anticipation warrants, it's because some point along the way in February, March, or April, the districts run out of funds to make payroll, so they issue a tax anticipation warrant to bridge the gap into June. And that's the reason why a school district may not appear that would have to do tax anticipation warrants, because the fiscal year in the school districts is June 30. So they get those tax collections in June, and you look at the fund balance on June 30, like, oh, there's money in the bank. They got a fund balance. Well, fund balance is always a snapshot time at June 30. Taxes come in June, that doesn't mean the balance on June 30 is as high as it was in May. In fact, it's not as high. The low point for school districts, most school districts, always going to be May, just before those tax collections come in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So the next slide talks about building a new bond building without a referendum. I think you've been provided tonight this section of the school code where it's highlighted in yellow that generally the school code says if you're going to build a new building, you have to have referendum approval to do it. With one exception, I'll talk about the exception in a little bit. So even if and this is unique to school districts, if a park district has within its means to build a new community center, it can build a new community center as long as it can pay for the construction of the building. Same thing with a city or village, library. If you have within your means to go to build a building and you don't need to get permission to issue bonds, they can build that new building. Schools, if a school building is going to house students, you have to get permission of the voters unless you use one of these exemptions, or the only exemption. And I should clarify too, that's really important, that's going to house students. If the school district want to build a new administrative center, it's not going to have students, they can build it without voter approval. So the district, the one exception, and that's highlighted again on that handout, is if the building is being leased during construction, or if it's already a building that's in existence and you're leasing it, you can put students into it. So the district would enter into a lease for the full amount of the project prior to beginning construction with this exemption. And I've worked on one or two of these a year for like the past 4 or 5 years, probably done 8 to 10 of them. So the district enters in then to the lease with a lessor. An example is Zions Bank. They've acted as lessor in all these transactions that we've done. A common misconception, though, is Zions Bank is also providing the funding. They do not provide the funding. They only act as lessor and to facilitate the plan. The funding comes from the sale of a lease certificate or lease obligation to investors in a public offering, just like you would a bond. So banks, mutual funds, casualty insurance companies, different types of retail type investors, all of them can buy and provide the funding just like you would for a bond issue. And some of my clients have then just paid that lease obligation out of their operating funds. They have the wherewithal within their budget to make that payment. You're not one of those districts that has the wherewithal in your budget to absorb a new payment on a bond. So districts like you in those circumstances and others would then issue, they would issue these alternate lease obligations as a first step. Almost like a bond anticipation. They're only anticipated to be outstanding about 60 to 90 days because ultimately, like my example earlier with the land contract, where that school district who bought the land didn't want to pay it out of its operating funds, they issued a funding bond to pay off the land contract and then levied for the bond issue. Well, the same thing would happen here is the school district would issue a funding bond to pay off the lease obligation, and then that funding bond would be payable within the debt service extension base constraint. Those lease obligations will only be outstanding likely if for 60 to 90 days. We make them callable after 60 days, so they're immediately, you can pay them off. Callable just means there's a period of time which you can't pay off a financial obligation. So as individuals, we can enter into debt and you can pay it off and refinance it anytime you want. In the municipal bond market, there's a period of time which you can't pay something off. Generally, if it's a long-term financing, it's anywhere from 7 to 10 years. Knowing that the goal is to pay this off almost immediately, we put a call provision on it that means it would have to be paid off in it could be paid off in 60 days. Sure.
Good. So wouldn't the investor in this case want a higher return than what we'd be paying for via the bonds? Meaning it'd be more expensive to do this than it would be to just finance the debt straight up. I mean, given current capital markets, right? Money's cheap, relatively speaking.
But the issue, you're doing this two-step process because you're not going to referendum. In order to do it in one financing, you'd have to do it as a referendum bond. So
you're paying more to avoid the referendum, essentially, right? It's more expensive to the district to do it this way.
It would be, yeah, potentially, yes, it would be more expensive to do it this way. So at this point, nothing's being recommended. This is just going through the process. Yes. Very good question. Costs are, because this is sold, when it's structured and it's sold, just give you a little more detail. It's set with 2 different interest rate periods. The first interest rate period is for about 120 days, knowing that's only going to be outstanding for a very short period of time. It's marketed like that. So you're going to get a short-term interest rate. Maybe like we just did one of these, the short-term interest rate was 1.375%. Even though if it stayed outstanding, it would have a 20-year term and reset to a higher interest rate at that point in time. But nobody anticipates it to be more outstanding for 120 days. So it helps keep the cost down. Plus, the vendors that work on these transactions know that really this is a single plan of finance that's going to be flipped into the long-term bond. So it's not like you pay the fees twice on it, because the fees on the first one are usually done at maybe a quarter of what a normal long-term bond would be done at. But that said, it is still more expensive than doing one bond.
Bob, could I just pause one? I have in my notes from our last meeting too, that a non-referendum bond requires a higher level of board approval.
Yes.
2/3, so it'd be required 5 out of the 7 members.
That's correct, because, well, not a non-referendum bond, but a lease.
A lease.
Yeah,
okay.
a lease requires 2/3 board approval.
Okay.
So it would be, 5 voters.
Just let me go back. You said you have conducted 8 to 10 of these lease debt certificate structure.
Yes.
I thought there has not been more than a couple in the whole state of Illinois. So your firm did all of them basically, or this is kind of somewhat unique, this structure, right?
Yeah, it's unique because oftentimes, for example, you take a Plainfield School District, the last one that did one, they're paying for out of their operating funds over a 10-year period. It's very unique that any school district would have the ability to absorb the payment. So it's one of the reasons it's not used, is because most school districts can't build a new building without the additional levy you get to support the bonds.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons it's not used very often.
Now, to your knowledge, is this method being challenged in court by any entity out there, to your knowledge?
It has not been challenged in, the only legal challenge occurred with Wheaton 200. They had one community member who filed a lawsuit to stop theirs. So the board instead, because Wheaton was another school district that had the wherewithal within their budget. They were doing $1 million payment for 20 years. And their board, instead of taking it to court, which their attorneys felt comfortable that they would win it, they said, well, this is just going to end up dragging on. We need to build this building. So they just scrapped the lease, went to referendum 3 months later, and the voters approved it. And then they went and did the lease obligation afterward. They still did a lease obligation, but they didn't want to drag it out in court. So there's never been a case taken to court.
Taken to court all the way.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Oh, I'm on slide 8 now. So I've already covered some of this. The next step is to pay off the alternate lease obligations with a funding bond. Funding bond's paid from a separate property tax that has to fit within the DSEB constraint. And remember, you had the $68 million debt margin, or $65 million debt margin. Well, the funding alternate lease obligations don't count against your legal debt margin, and funding bonds do not count at the time of issuance. So that's why on a non-referendum basis, you would be able to do this and exceed your legal debt margin, but you would be exceeding it a lot. So before we get into too much detail on that, just wait till we get to the summary at the end on that. The district takes ownership of the building once the building is constructed and the lease is canceled. So what are the potential risks of a lease financing? A change in law prevents the district from taking ownership of the building once construction is completed and the lease is paid off. So your plan, if you were to do it, is you'd issue the funding bonds to pay off the lease obligations. Then when school construction was completed, let's say 2 years later, you could take ownership of the building. But what if the General Assembly changed the law during that time and you weren't able to take possession of the building? So that's a risk that needs to be disclosed. If a private entity is used as lessor, there's a chance the property would be subject to property taxes. That has not happened in the other financings we've worked on, because oftentimes, or every time, the property that is being built on, the district already owns, so the property is in the name of the school district. But if for some reason the county clerk said, no, this is, Zions Bank is the lessor on this, we're going to start taxing it. So there's a chance, at least during that 2-year period of time, you could be taxed on the building that is really being used for public purposes. One of the mitigating factors of that risk is if you had to pay taxes on it, you receive roughly, I think, 70% of the property taxes as the school district. So most of that money be coming right back to you. And the last risk to cover is whether the lessor enters bankruptcy. Now, remember, the lessor is not providing the funding. So the risk that you have is, let's say the lessor went bankrupt and Bank XYZ took over the lease during that 2-year period of time. Zions Bank annual fees act as lessor about $1,000. So your risk would be, well, what if the bank who took it over wants to charge you double that or 3 times that? Okay, you would only have that risk for a short period of time because it wouldn't be outstanding very long.
So the lessor is not providing the funding, so they're the middle person. So
Mr. Brown, Mike.
the lessor is not providing the funding, so they are the so-called a middle person, but they are going to get some type of benefit from it, financial benefit from this process, as well as the entity that's providing the funding, right?
They get $1,000 payment a year.
1,000?
Yeah.
A year?
Yeah, they act as lessor.
Okay.
This is, Zions Bank does a lot of these types of transactions out west because a lot of financing's done out there with leases. So they act as this facilitator in the process. That their main role at what Zions Bank acts as is a bond register paying agent. And what a bond register paying agent, and there's one on every bond issue, is they send the invoices every 6 months, reminding you to make your payments. They send out call notices when bonds are being called. And that normal fee is about $500 per year. So they're basically making double, acting as the facilitator. But in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about this multi-million-dollar plan, it's not a large fee.
For them, okay.
Right.
Keep it moving and keep it going.
Yep. So now let's look at the scenarios. So there's a lot of information on slide 11. It's an interest rate graph of an index. Yes. And just like the Dow Jones Industrials tells you what's going on in the stock market, which we know that's been bouncing wildly here lately. The main takeaway on this is just look at the far right, is interest rates are at historic lows. And since they gave this chart last week, they've come down even more. The Fed just cut rates 0.5%, I think, yesterday. So, yeah. So interest rates are at all-time historic lows to take away from this chart. Just to give you some perspective of where we're at. So now we're going to look at 3 different scenarios. These are just meant to be illustrative and to contrast different options. Once a plan is decided upon, we probably take the option that's chosen here and then look at some variations of that once if a decision was made to go for a financing was made. So these are just meant, again, to contrast 3 different ways to go about this plan. The first one would be a $109 million referendum option. So if you did option 2 and everybody signed off on that and you went to the voters and you got approval for $109 million, but you didn't get the 30-year authority from the state, you'd have to pay that back over a 20-year period. In this chart, your green bars are your non-referendum bonds. The dark blue bars are your current referendum bonds as restructured. One of the goals from the Finance Committee was to not increase the annual payment above the current amount of $12 million in any plan of finance. So it requires a restructuring of some of the referendum bonds. The light blue bonds or columns represent the payments on the $109 million. So you are actually able to squeeze $109 million into a 20-year structure, but you notice there's not much of a decrease in the overall payment over the entire term of the bonds. What the Finance Committee, in recommending that we go for the 30-year option, was they wanted to see that go down at some point to actually provide a lower overall levy to the taxpayers. So the subsequent plans you're going to see shows that we maintain the payment, the current $12 million amount as it's currently scheduled. Right now, the payment is scheduled to be at that $12 million through levy year 25 and decline. So in all the scenarios, we maintain that, and then we have a decline afterwards. Here, the decline is rather negligible because you're boxed into doing it in 20 years. You couldn't do a non-referendum plan for $109 million in 20 years. So we're not even showing you a non-referendum 20-year plan. The most you get on a non-referendum basis on a 20-year plan is approximately $80 million.
Bob, can I throw something in there? Also, it gives us very little cushion. So if we did have an emergency or something came up, we would be very limited in what we could borrow if we went with this plan.
That's correct, without raising taxes.
Right.
Yeah, well, we're still showing the red bar in this graph for context. The referendum bonds don't apply to that Only non-referendum bonds apply to it. So that's why the light blue is able to go above the D-sub constraint, because it's not subject to it. And we're assuming in here the bonds are issued over a 40-year period. That could always be adjusted depending upon the construction schedule that's put together. It would be difficult shortening it much more than that, because in order to get them all and not into the constraint of not increasing the payment, you really had to spread it out over a period of years, which usually is not a problem, because if you're doing a major construction program, you can't do it all at one time.
So this is a referendum scenario.
Yes.
And so we're probably talking about GO bonds, right?
Yep.
And was there ever a conversation, or did you ever share with the powers to be, the team, using capital appreciation bonds?
No, none of these plans involve capital appreciation bonds.
Thank God.
Yeah, it will not be involved in the plan at all.
Thank you.
Yes.
There is a God.
I don't think the mayor would have let me come here.
We had a lot of projects that have been paid off with capital appreciation bonds.
Yes.
And that's not good. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. So the next slide shows you another referendum option, but this is one assuming you get 30-year authority. So by being able to spread the bond payments over 30 years, we're able to lower the payment in levy year 26 to $10 million. So, you're reducing that levy by a sixth when you get to that point in time. So to provide some tax relief to the taxpayers. And then it's maintain a level amount going forward, which also would give you the flexibility if you had to issue bonds for other projects. And the goal is you're taking care of a lot of these capital needs. So hopefully you don't have to issue bonds for other projects. But if you did, you would be able to do a non-referendum bond at some point without an increase in taxes.
So we lowered the overall annual cost of our debt, but overall we will pay more to assume this debt. And what is that value? Oh, you're getting to that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Those are all good questions. Yeah. But it's the similar thing we encounter as individuals when nobody buys their first home. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. Most people never buy their first home with a 15-year mortgage because they wouldn't be able to afford the payment. But so they get a 30-year mortgage, which means you're going to pay back more interest because you're paying it back over 30 years and 15 years. So there's always that trade-off. If you want a lower payment, extend the payment, you're going to be paying back more interest. There hasn't been much better time ever, though, to extend the payment, given where we're at with interest rates. Now, how long interest rates stay at these levels depends upon the outlook of the economy. As a result, as we all know, we're having this coronavirus scare going around now. And while that is not something we want to deal with, it has been very positive for the bond market because interest rates have come down substantially as a result of the scare. But your bonds being issued over a period of time. So one of the things that we've done when we've done these structures is we've added a 0.5% to them, which by now, we ran these numbers, that was a few weeks ago. So it's probably more like 0.75%, not approaching a full percentage over where the current market is right now. The assumption is your interest rate baked into this analysis is an average of about 3.75. Some of the series will be lower, some will be higher, but it's around 3.75. Again, if you're able to sell it today, you probably would be all in around 3%. The last slide shows you, and one of the benefits, while the slide 13 shows you that, again, this was assuming a 4-year period, the 30-year authority would additionally give you the ability, if you had to shorten it, you might be able to shorten your construction period to 2 to 3 years. You don't have that flexibility in either the 20-year referendum plan or the non-referendum plan. You couldn't really shorten it any more than 4 years. So the last slide shows you the non-referendum plan. And that means the light blue bars, all those payments have to fit underneath the red line because all those bonds will be subject to the debt service extension base. In this version of the plan, you have a subsequent drop off in levy year 2041. That's sooner than you saw on the prior page with the referendum plan. I don't want anybody to take away that, well, you're getting a drop off sooner in the non-referendum plan. I like that one better, a second drop off. You can structure the referendum plan to have the second drop off in the same year too. So it's a referendum plan, we're actually able to pay the bonds off a little sooner on the 30-year plan than you can with the 30-year non-referendum plan. You have a lot more flexibility with the referendum bonds and how to structure them than you do with the non-referendum bonds. So the last slide here, I'm sorry, it's not the last slide, second to last slide, shows you the impact to the taxpayer based off the median home value of the district. This information comes from the Census Bureau, the American Community Survey. They provide a median home value for the district. In the appendice, we have this broken down with the median home value by community, because obviously the district is going to be a homogeneous number of all the communities within the boundaries. So here it shows you what your current bond payment is estimated at in the first column. Then it shows you what it is with a 30-year referendum authority. And you can see how the payment drops off from 806 to 674. With a 20-year referendum, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at levy year 25 to levy year 26. So you see a decrease in the bill of about $131. In the 20-year authority, you have a decrease from that year to the next, but it's only about $30. So you don't really see a decline in the payment if you try to squeeze it all in the 20 years. And then the 30-year non-referendum bond has a very similar outlook, at least for the initial several years, as the 30-year referendum plan. So the annual change in payment is the annual change in payment on that series. It's not giving you a comparison between the options. To compare one option to the other, you got to eyeball it across. So again, when you look at levy year 26, that's when you have the decrease. It's 674 for the 30-year referendum, 777 for 20-year referendum, and 674 for the non-referendum. So your homeowners are saving about $100 on their bond portion of their bill. The difference in interest costs, we'll actually have to dig into the appendix to answer that question, Mr. Brown. So when we get to this, I'll dig into the appendix.
Okay.
So what are the pros and cons? And we've come up with pros and cons on this summary slide. You might come up with other pros and cons that we haven't put here. The pro of the referendum is it requires direct voter approval, and you have some payment structuring flexibility within the constraints. One of the constraints that was put forth was to maintain the payment, okay? The con is the referendum bonds count against the debt limit, so the district would need permission from the General Assembly to exceed the debt limit of $65 million.
Well, let's go back to the referendum, the pros.
Okay.
You put here direct voter, as opposed to the referendum, the pros, and you put down here direct voter approval. How do you see that as a pro?
Well, I guess that would depend on your perspective.
Well, you put it there.
I know.
Okay.
I mean, in my opinion, when you're doing two new schools and you're going almost twice over your legal debt margin, that's something probably should go to the voters. I guess my expertise is finance, but at some point the politics of it's public finance, right? So you got to deal with the public and the finance portion at the same time. That perspective would be, this type of plan would probably be better off to go to the voters. Some may say, well, that direct voter approval may be a con because that means we got to wait till you get voter approval to sell the bonds. So might miss an opportunity for historically low interest rates. I don't believe interest rates are going to be a year from now 2% higher, even 1% higher. But they're, if this coronavirus scare ends up not being as drastic as we all hope, well, interest rates will come up some. How much they come up, is anybody's guess. But that's, so it's one of that may be a con from somebody's perspective to have direct voter approval. Is it takes longer to get into the market.
Join the political world. You might vote for governor.
My background is in economics, so they always say, if you ask an economist a question, they'll give you on one hand it's this, the other hand it's this, and if you want to answer from him, you have to cut off one of his hands. So.
I don't want to do that. Okay. You might start bleeding. I like that one though.
So so a con is you have to get approval from the General Assembly to exceed your legal debt margin. Experience has taught us that anybody who's gone for that exception has been granted it as long as your local legislators approve it. And since you're already going to your local legislators for 30-year authority, you would be an ask to just give them a slightly amended bill that also asks for this. Another con is process cannot begin until late spring, early summer, depending on when the voters approve it. So if you went to the November election and you got approval, as soon as you can sell bonds would be 60 to 90 days later, because once you get voter approval, you have to go through a canvassing period of 21 days. And there's a 30-day petition period. So the earliest you could sell would be 60 days later if you wanted to sell the bonds and get rid of market risk per se. There may be a reason that you want to wait longer because you're not going to be able to get into substantive work probably until the summer. Would I be right if you passed it in the fall? Spring maybe? So versus if you did a non-referendum, it would let you, you can flip over to the non-referendum side. Usually when you're doing this, the cons on one end being the pros of the other and vice versa. So pro of the non-referendum is you wouldn't need referendum, or you wouldn't need General Assembly approval to exceed the legal debt margin as long as you could fit the payments into your DSEP. And you could begin the construction process sooner, maybe as soon as 2020 on a non-referendum basis. I do want to, before I cover the cons, I do want to mention, because one of the things I talked about the Finance Committee, and I don't think the Finance Committee was necessarily for this option. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they can speak up, is this isn't an either or. It's either all referendum or all non-referendum. You could do a combination of non-referendum bonds for a portion of the projects if there's certain things you want to start tackling now. For example, if you want to do a $25 million working cash bond to start tackling some of the things on the list, you could do that, and then you'd ask the voters for a smaller question, which would obviously contain the 2 new buildings, maybe some of the other projects that you had to do.
But either way, if you do a portion of it, there's still a petitionary period on the money you're trying to borrow.
There could be, unless you were going to do life safety, because
Yeah,
life safety
life
doesn't
safety.
have a petition period.
Sure. Okay.
So just want to throw that out there, that is a potential to do a combination of the two. It's not an either or. A con is, one, you have as much payment flexibility because of the DSEB, which I just showed you in that graph. We got to fit everything under that red line. But I want to spend some time on this other con, which is why another reason I don't think doing the plan that you're considering on a non-referendum basis is one that makes a lot of sense, is because you would have to go through as many as 5 different petition periods to do it. So you would do an alternate lease obligation that requires a petition period. And the threshold for that is not 10%, it's 7.5%. So that's one. You get through that one, you sell those obligations, let's say it's $40 million. Now you want to sell the funding bonds to pay it off. Now you got to go through a petition period. And then you're going to do the second elementary school, because you wouldn't be able to do them at the same time because of the staging that was required to do the fit all in the DSEB. Now you got to do a petition period for that alternate lease obligation.
And at any time in those 4
can be
5
stopped.
period, you can stop.
You can stop.
The public can stop you and
Yes,
say, if
right.
you want a referendum, and then that can mess up, derail the whole project.
Yeah, you might end up billing, like if,
Talk about that now.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. You're picking up on that quick.
Yeah.
yeah, so if you get, let's say you got through the first 2 and you're billing which elementary that you did first, and now you're doing the other one and you get petitioned, like, now what do you tell that community? You don't get yours until we go to the voters.
Yes.
And then the 5th one would be if you did the working cash bonds for the non-new school projects. So there's a lot of risk that the voters were going to ask for a say anyhow, which sort of directs you to the pro that I had on the referendum side, is you ask the voters and you're asking the voters once. So that was the summary of that, those plans. I do want to ask you a question, or answer your question about the difference in cost between the 20-year referendum and the non-referendum.
Yes.
For that, I need to jump here into the appendix.
Okay, here we go.
So the 20-year, I'm on slide 24. The 20-year referendum scenario, if I look at the bottom of the green column, that shows $292 million.
Let me get my magnet.
Yeah. Now that doesn't mean this whole plan is costing 200, because remember, that's a total including your current debt service. So we're just going to take the difference between those 2 columns. So it's $292 million for the 20-year referendum of current and proposed bonds. And I flip over to slide 25. 7, and that is $311.5 million. So take the difference between those two numbers, you're looking at $20 million more that you pay back, stretching from 20 to 30 years. It's probably not as much as you thought it would be.
No, well, it's typical, like usually on a home mortgage, you usually like at the end of the day, 3 times the amount of what you borrowed.
Yeah, that used to be true. Like we were just talking earlier about when we both got our first mortgages. I forget your last name, sorry. Our interest rate was 8%. That definitely been true then. You probably pay back 2 to 3 times more in interest than you originally borrowed. But in today's interest rate environment, where we're getting mortgages at 2 point something,
It's a big difference.
yeah, there's a big difference. So.
How many points are you adding to the interest rate, current interest rate?
Uh,
When you do your scenarios here?
Yeah, what percent?
Yeah, originally we added, I think the footnote says 0.5%, but we ran these as a January.
Hold on one second, Bob. I just asked about how many points you're adding to the current interest rate when you calculate these numbers.
So when you look at the scenarios in the appendices, there's a footnote on all of them. It says it's based on current market rates as of January 29th plus 0.5%.
Okay.
But I was saying earlier, since January 29th, rates have probably come down anywhere depending on where you're at in the yield curve, 1/4 to 0.5%. So now it probably has an extra 0.75% to a full 1% baked in. And when you're doing the multi-stage plan of finance, you're always concerned about, okay, well, what about the financing in the 3rd and 4th year? We don't know what interest rates are going to be at that time. Well, one thing to keep in mind is when you sell the first financing, whatever that is, those rates are locked in. So the extra 0.5% or whatever it is at that point in time on that piece of the financing, that goes away because now you have the actual rates, which means now you can tolerate higher interest rates on the subsequent financings because those rates are locked in.
So there's no recommendation, again, we're going back to GO bonds for referendum, right? And I guess it would not be prudent to even seek callable bonds, right? Bonds where you can, I guess refinance
Well,
at
we
some
would
point, right?
Well, I would
Have
still put a
callable
call
bonds.
provision on it.
You would do that?
Yeah,
But that's usually you cannot usually do that until 10 years, right?
8 to 10 years is when they're callable, which while you might think, why would we would never be able to refinance these. We thought that back in the bonds that were sold right after the Great Recession when interest rates plummeted.
Right.
We're refinancing some of those bonds today. Because remember when you sell a bond issue, what is the interest rate, when you sell bonds, you don't have one interest rate like we do on our mortgage and our car payment. Every year is different. So the first principal payment has one rate, the second, and so on and so forth. So what is your interest rate in years 11 and after? After 10 years, what was the interest rate in year 11 is now the interest rate in year 1. So what might have been a 3% rate in year 11 is lining up in year 1 when interest rates might be 1.5%. So you can still refinance those bonds typically.
Okay, that's
So, and the market's accustomed to that and having a normal call of 8 to 10 years. You're not really going to pay a penalty for that. So, and look at what happened with your capital appreciation bonds. Those were not callable, and you're stuck with them. So,
All right. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just say, I think, Bob, you said you can put your own pros and cons in here. I think, I agree. I mean, full transparency, I think the right thing to do is to go to referendum, and it gives the district the most flexibility. But the con is if it doesn't pass, we're out of bullets. I mean, we don't have a plan B really. So that's the risk.
Repair in place. That's your
That's
plan.
repair in place, and
that life safety is your
life
plan B.
safety is- Yeah. And
Yep.
that's not even, life safety doesn't cover everything in column
No,
A,
it does
which is
not.
repair in place.
Yeah,
So,
that was going to be my question. If we go to referendum and it doesn't pass, what is our option?
You would then do whatever that has been identified by Dave, that the state will then qualify as life safety. You can then issue a non-referendum life safety bond to finance those improvements, as long as the total of that doesn't exceed your legal debt margin, which is $65 million.
And of course, that does not include air conditioning in any of our buildings. It does not include any additions or wings or anything like that.
So in your recommendation, because of the 2 buildings, referendum.
Yes.
And then obviously if it passes, we move forward. If it doesn't, then we go back to life safety of whatever, $15 million and that's it.
Right, unless you were to do a working cash bond afterwards, but
Still
that,
petition period.
that would have the petition period. So what are your voters going to think when you pass a notice of intent for $20 million and you put it in the paper? Like, we just said no, what are you doing? So.
I'm going to have Reverend Hunt, can you just give a quick synopsis of the recommendation of the committee, and then we can have some folks ask questions.
First of all, I want to thank Bob for that presentation. The committee, even from the beginning, one of the things that we wanted to promote was transparency. And the issue of referendum versus non-referendum was actually first and foremost. And again, after listening to some of the pros and cons in the presentation, some of the earlier presentations that we received, we determined that part of this, working together with the facilities, the finance committee, we really have to make the business case to the community if we're going to get this approved, given some of the history and the referendums from the past. And so it's going to be incumbent. I think that's one of the reasons that the committees have come together. We're from the community, representing all sectors and all the communities. And so this is essentially, if we're going out to our community, to the folks who live in these communities and our students, we're going to have to come together over this. So again, the referendum, for me, not going to referendum was not an issue. And we kind of, when it came down to the gist of it, that's what we come up with. It kind of lines up with what needs to be done. So does anybody have any questions?
Board members?
Comments?
For me as a board member, I agree, because at the end of the day, it's the taxpayers' money. And we're about to invoke on a project of historic proportions here.
The other thing that we kind of talked about, and I'm sure most of the people in here, if I said, give me a show of hands of everybody that really comprehends all this, you're not going to see a lot of hands go up. And think about how that transmits out to the public. Do you want to make this case one time, or do you want to make it 5 times? I think you're going to have an uphill climb to make it one time, let alone 5 times. So because of the volume of information, the complexity of the whole package, it's going to be very difficult to get everybody to understand what it is they're voting for, how it gets cast in the referendum and stuff like that. Is going to be very important, because we don't want to deceive anybody. But you're going to have to be very transparent on this, because it's going to be a tough sell. It really is. I mean, you're going out to the 2045, 2047 period, and that's a territory that nobody's been in around here before. And I think that it's. I guess I personally don't want to fight this battle one time, So I think that's kind of what our whole group kind of talked about.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say, Nelson?
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's just too much risk in the fact that you'd have to have those 5 petition periods, and you get one school built, and then that community petitions and says, I got mine, and I'm going to stop. That's not a risk I'm willing to take for this community in this school district. So
we actually identified that primarily in relation to the Monee issue.
Right.
I think it's I don't want to say it's a foregone conclusion, but Monee's already got an elementary school. Why would they vote to extend the debt? Just because they're benevolent? I don't know. But that's an issue that's going to have to be addressed, because they're voters in the organization.
Wait, Mr. Einhorn, I just want to let you know that in a facility committee, we discussed that. I looked over at Denisha and said, the hardest sell for this entire plan will be going to Monee, because the voters that voted for the referendum back in, and I'm going to guess here, 2005, 2004, whatever it was, they left, they moved. So now you have all new people, not everyone, but the majority. So we were having a discussion that, you know, 109 million and Monee's getting $100,000 in life safety. So that's gonna be our hardest battle, and anybody else from Monee in here.
And a piece of land gifted to the village.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yes, and the MEC building, if we go with one of the plans.
I do have a question about that, just out of curiosity. We have some village leaders. Are those buildings, I mean, do you want those buildings? And we're talking about community centers and just happens to be something I know more about than all this other stuff. It takes a lot of money to run a community center. So I'm wondering, do these villages really have a budget to do that when we're talking about this gift that we're giving of these buildings?
Get Denisha that mic.
While I am not a voting member, I know that I have spoken with members of the board, including the mayor. And of course, we would love to have a recreation center, and the building, of course, would be great for us. I know that we were talking about it being, you know, a hard sell for Monee. However, I believe that that would be the main point of being able to have the transparency and communicating the information that's needed to all of the residents so that they have a clear understanding as of what's going on, as opposed to just saying, okay, well, we got this going on and not having them have a clear understanding. So if we're able to communicate that, you know, in a better manner to where they really understand what's going on, then I believe that you would have not as much of an issue when it comes to the referendum.
From the Village of Crete standpoint, I think that the jury is still out on that issue. You know, giving us the building. We've talked about that internally, Mike Smith. We've talked about that internally. But doing anything with it and turning that into something productive for the village is a little more complicated for the Village of Crete than it is probably for University Park and for Monee particularly. And that's because if you're talking about rec centers and all that kind of stuff, that's part of their municipal government. In the Village of Crete, we have a park district, and that's a completely different set of circumstances than what Monee has and what University Park has. We originally thought maybe if we ever decided to build a new municipal building and maybe fire station or one or the other or maybe both, where the Crete Elementary School presently is, may be a good spot for it. So from that standpoint, we're kind of interested in it, but I don't have the money to build either one of those right now. So what do I do with it in the meantime? You know, that's going to be
See Bob Lewis.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Get out your checkbook, Bob. It's just, you know, you look at those things and you conceptualize them, but it's another thing to write a check for it. And that's a problem. And who knows which way the economy is going. You know, we just got through building a $1 million+ EMA building, and we went as cheap as we could possibly go to get what we needed. We're not flush with money, and that ate up all of our non-referendum bonding abilities. You know, 1.35 million, that's what it was. So for us to go out and do anything, it's going to probably require a referendum. And some people would say, live within your means. And some people would say, yeah, you deserve one. Who knows where it's going to fall, you know, but you have to be able to pay it off. When we went out and bonded, we're paying a very minimal amount every year. We're paying $100,000 every year. Our actual debt requirement's about 110. We're paying the other 10 from a surplus that we actually have in the bond fund right now that I know I can carry out 15 years to make the payments. So, you know, there's a lot of dancing that you have to do to be able to understand and finance all that stuff. So it looks good on paper, but turning the looks good on paper to the looks good in reality, at least for the Village of Crete, it requires some additional thought. And the board has not weighed in on any of that stuff yet. So, and the other thing I wanted to tell you, because I don't know if this is the right time, but I received a phone call from Thaddeus Jones over the weekend. And I will tell you that he is absolutely very absolute about this issue. And what he said is every municipality has got to submit a resolution in order to get this bill for the extension from 20 to 30 years passed. If every municipality doesn't send them a resolution on this, chances are it's going nowhere. That's what he told me. And I don't know if that's, whether he's told other people different things, but that's what he's told me. So I said, the Village of Crete thinks it's a good idea to go out to 30 years, because obviously I made that suggestion. That's how it got here. But I don't know what University Park or Monee or Park Forest is going to say. And I don't know how fast he needs that, but some of this stuff takes time to get it, past the board and get it in front of the board and all that kind of stuff. So we probably don't have a whole lot of time.
Let me address this one point. It's not a resolution from the mayors. It is the letter that I already gave you. I've already talked with all the mayors. That letter needs to be, I'm creating a package to give to them by the 16th, and it requires the public hearing. It requires a letter signed from each of my mayors, and I've already talked with all of them. They've all said that they're going to give them to me. The one piece that's missing, and this is some guidance and direction I need from my board here, is we have given a bill right now. If we are going to the direction of a referendum, I have to go in and amend that bill within a week. So I need some guidance. It doesn't mean we have to go there, but it just means I have to have the language in that bill. And then we also have our public hearing on Tuesday. So again, this discussion, I really need to hear from my board and giving me some direction. You're not voting on it, but you just give me a direction to say, hey, I think we may be going in that direction, because then I have to put the amendment in tomorrow to start working this, and I have to change the letter that I gave each of my mayors to include the one line that says with referendum. So that's what's coming.
Now, if we voted on the resolution, and now you're seeking to amend the resolution, and you're saying we do not have to formally vote on it,
so
will
let me
that
go
call
back.
for a special meeting? I'm
So
just saying, I'm trying to understand.
it is a sequence, so it takes some time. So we've already done a resolution for the board for 20 to 30 years.
That's correct.
We're going to have to amend that and then redo a new one to include the referendum. That's going to be in our board packet coming up.
Okay, but what was the drop dead time? You said by
It's really the
16th?
16th to the 17th. So I mean, we're right there. That's what I'm saying. We're
Our
right
board
there.
meeting is on the 17th.
It is on the 17th. So that's why I said we're really sequencing things really fairly tightly.
Can we turn it into a special?
Can we
meeting
turn the
on
committee of the
10th?
whole into a special meeting just for the time frame?
We possibly could, and that would be a discussion that
I
the
know
board
that
has to
that
ask.
upsets some people, but this really
Yeah,
is
but
time.
this is
sensitive.
important to the communities.
Yeah. So, like I said, it can be done, but like I said, we're right there.
Mr. Robert, just two quick things. When it comes to the buildings and giving those to community, I think, we'll have discussion, depending on what plan we have, we'll have discussion with each of the communities to see what their needs are, and see if there's a want there on that. And then we'll bring, of course, that back to the board and share that with you. I think as Mike had said, each community is going to be different, on whether they want it or not. Crete would have 2 buildings available. I don't know. So there you go.
Is
All right.
Balmoral?
Balmoral's a prize.
Is that
You
in
can have Balmoral.
Balmoral in the village?
There you go.
Balmoral is in the village?
Yeah. Balmoral
It is.
in
It isn't.
Crete,
It's
yeah.
not unincorporated Creek.
I don't know that. I didn't know.
It's in the, okay.
And I think, again, depending on what those discussions are, then we'll make a recommendation to the board of what we think should happen with those facilities and that. So, that's my thought. The second thing I do want to mention is that I've been monitoring the construction task force of the state of Illinois concerning any grants that are available. If you remember, the governor had put into his budget some funding for construction of schools. So I've been monitoring that. They came out with their final report and said, yeah, the money's needed. We don't know where it's coming from yet, but it would be in the form of grants and not in loans. So I think they're working on the funding of that to see if they can come up with anything. We, of course, would apply for those. I know Bob I was talking about the construction task force. I don't know if you have any insight. I read their final report. You know, it really says we need the money. You know, we'll see if it gets funded and all that stuff. From what I read, it's going to be in the form of grants and not in loans.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I read the same report. It was not as definitive as we have liked, you know, left some open questions. One of the main things that came out of it is do not award grants unless you have the money on hand to fund them. And you can't depend upon it at this time. I would, you know, maybe as the year goes on, but I wouldn't expect a lot of movement on that, just be given the other stuff that the governor has on his plate right now. Perhaps, so the voters would have to approve the whole amount, and then maybe afterwards you might be able to apply for the grant and maybe lower it, but I don't think you can count on it in any sort of referendum campaign.
And I
Are you talking about, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you talking about the last big project, building the new high school and Monee Elementary School back in 2004, 5, 6, somewhere around there? We was able to get reimbursed in 2012, memory serves me right, of $23.7 million of capital funding. Yeah. So are we talking about that right now? Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So at what stage in the process do you apply for that? You're saying?
We don't know yet.
We don't know yet.
We don't know that yet.
Yeah, we don't know yet, but the recommendation is they should not allow people to apply until they have the money to actually give them that money. So it's a little different. In the past, they would let you apply, but then and then get the funding later on, which we all know that eventually they stop getting the funding.
Okay.
Right.
Wow.
You were fortunate enough to be on the 02 or 03 list that they funded after several years of not funding them, and they left off on the 04 list. And I know many of those districts have been craving to get that money that they're owed, and they're essentially been told they're probably not going to get it.
They made an announcement.
They
are not getting it.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah.
Bob,
I mean,
they made an announcement at the IASB dinner last night. Mrs. Roop and I attended, and they said, it's goodbye. It's not
Right.
going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's those people in 2004 that have been sitting there waiting or did things. Too bad. I mean, he told us that last night,
I
that
think the other
there's
thing I
not going
got
to be
out of it
anything
too,
done
Bob,
about
correct me if
that.
I'm wrong, is that they'll use the evidence-based funding model
Yes.
kind of to prioritize things.
Which is good for you,
which
too.
is good for us, actually, too.
Let's
No
get back on,
guarantees
let's pull us back in a little bit. If we are to amend our resolution for the 30-year financing to include the referendum, which I think makes sense. The one question I have, and maybe this, Bob, maybe you could answer this question. If we amend our resolution to go out for 30 years to also incorporate that it would encompass a referendum, is there a time frame on that referendum, or is that legislation kind of in there for perpetuity? And maybe this is a better question for council.
It depends on what's going on in Springfield at the time. Some of those you'll see that it's there. Some will say for this specific date. Usually the length of time legislation usually just sustains itself. It doesn't go away. But for the referendum, because sometimes schools will go prior to getting the referendum approval. Other times they'll go after they got the referendum approval. I prefer the former, just because you got to message this to your taxpayers. And if you don't know if you have the authority and you're telling them, okay, this is what the impact's going to be, and let's say the General Assembly never gives it to you, and then your voters approve it, now you're in a situation of, well, they approved the bonds, but I didn't get the ability to go out 30 years. Should we go ahead and sell them? Because now we got to amortize them over 20 years. So I think it's more prudent to get ahead of time.
No, I agree. So
what
my recommendation is that we convert the committee of the whole meeting to a special meeting where we can have that as an action item.
All right, but am I also hearing, I need something even prior to that, just a direction? We would be doing a vote, at that meeting, but I need a direction to start getting the paperwork for the mayors and so forth. So I guess I need some direction.
So are you asking us for consensus on approval to go ahead and
just to move forward?
To move forward on amending the resolution?
Adding the referendum.
Or
Thinking about the referendum, yes,
Right,
because I have
so
to
that
change
would
all my
be the
paperwork.
amendment.
Yes.
Well, I mean, if we're looking at these different options, I think we almost have to do that. That's my opinion. I don't see how we could not tell you to go ahead and go forward with that.
I don't, at this point, given all the information we have, I don't think there's any way to avoid a referendum. And not that not that we should try, but I think referendum is going to be part and parcel to this overall package. So
I agree, and I might suggest if we change next week's meeting to a special meeting, that maybe we would just film it again, and maybe that would appease people that
I agree. I think
that we're trying to do.
we should be filming
Yeah.
special board meetings.
Right.
And that maybe we put it on our website. You know, the committee of the whole meeting is now a special meeting. Get it out there right away so that people who check our website for things see that if we have it on the front page, maybe in some way, the homepage.
Right, because we are having that public hearing ahead of time, and part of this now becomes part of the package that we discuss. So I think that's why it's good to have a direction, so we can plan better for that public hearing.
Any thoughts on that?
How, with this special meeting, are we just looking to talk about this issue at the special meeting, or can we bundle some other things?
We have an opportunity to bundle.
Okay.
We were going to have our regular business items on there as well.
Okay.
But if we were going to take any action such as this, we would need to make it the special board meeting.
But just some non-actions, the issue
Yes.
I was talking about.
Yeah, a lot of
We can
discussions.
vet that.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
Bill, Sandy, any?
No, I just want to make sure that let's make it a special meeting. I mean, I think that's the right thing to do. Because that's what we're gonna vote on the one item, right? That's all we're voting.
The resolution, correct.
Yeah, the time-sensitive item.
Very time sensitive.
Okay, I will move forward with those plans. All right, I think that adjourns at least okay. Well, I meant
I would just say, all of this, ultimately, the recommendations that come out of the committees are going to have to come back to the board for approval. So, and this is an opportunity that, since we have a joint meeting, we have all the board members present except for Ms. Mitchell. If board members have questions that they want the committees to research further, I think now is the time to make sure that the committees are doing the work and kind of getting ahead to answer the board's questions.
And I'm going to piggyback on that. I would like to thank every person who shows up for these meetings, who does the work, who comes and asks the tough questions and is going to make the tough decisions. I just want to say to all of you, thank you very much for always being there and for getting a hold of Dr. Kara, or if we need to get to Bob, give us time. So I know this has taken a lot of time from you and we have a lot of work to do. So personally, from me, I would like to say thank you for being here and helping us work through this. It's a huge, huge commitment, and I appreciate it because we couldn't do it without you. I mean, we can't do this. We need your help. So thank you.
I agree with my colleague, and just as much rigor that's been put forth, with this fervent labor that the committee members have done. We're going to need just that much and much more from various members of the community to push this through and communicate to the taxpayers, what's at stake and what it is to gain from this. So thank you, guys.
But just to summarize, I feel like before I was hearing from some board members that we need a little more details around programming from the facilities committee that before it's going to, before we get to a point for a full vote. So that's going to.
I know there's more things I want to discuss. I don't necessarily know if it needs to be with everybody, if it needs to be at a board meeting. I mean, I definitely have more things I want to discuss. I'm not ready to just take a recommendation and vote on it.
Maybe at some point we need a board meeting to just discuss this topic. And there may be things in there that we would go back to the committees with concerns, but.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to format that right now. I just know that I feel like the committees have done a ton of work and I really appreciate it. And then we have these snippets of the information and we really just haven't had a chance to really discuss it. I feel like even in this type of forum, we had our things that we wanted to talk about, But I have a lot more I want to say about programming and different things regarding the buildings. It just didn't seem like the time right now.
I agree.
Plus, a lot of the information that I just got today and I haven't had a chance to dissect it.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there's just a lot more I'd like to talk about. It's just now is not the time.
Okay.
I'm 100% in agreement with you on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll turn the meeting back
Okay,
to you now.
Yeah. you need to
Do
be
we have anything else
comfortable.
No.
to adjourn? Okay,
Well, we go back to regular board meeting now.
okay.
You know, especially if you're not involved in one of these committees.
Where's my agenda?
That's what I can do if you want to look at mine.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, the next item on the agenda is to adjourn. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Yeah.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.